Festival. After the work that Jeremy is going to read for us will not be the time for tedious administrative announcements, so I'm going to make one now. We are intent on doing this again. We believe that we have secured a first sponsor from the commercial world, which we will be talking about later in the year. And that, we hope, means with your support, we can carry on having the West Cork History Festival. We will look for your input and your ideas. So please, the Information Act notwithstanding, tell us what you think. We will have you on our mailing list, and we will continue to be in touch with you. But please do respond. And thank you all for coming, and to all of those others who've come over the course of the weekend and made it a fascinating event, certainly for those of us who have helped organize it. I'd like to thank again the committee. But without any further introduction from me, I'd like you to welcome Jeremy Irons, who is going to read a selection of poetry drawn from the Great War and the Irish Revolutionary period. And it seemed to us, and we hope it will seem to you, that this stitched together some of the strands of what we had been talking about over the course of the weekend. Jeremy will say more about the interconnections between each piece as he talks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you all for being here at the end of what I think is a fantastic weekend. And it's nice to gentle out of it on an evening like this with a little bit of poetry. It's not too long, so those of you who have to go to work in the morning, don't worry. You'll be out of here soon enough. Simon made this selection and introduced me. I'm going to have a little more light, I think. Like that little desk light or something would be lovely to have here so I can see, because I'm getting very old and very blind. Will that plug in that? Great, just so it throws on my book. It's a selection of poems by Anglo-Irish poets, Irish poets, aristocratic poets, peasant poets, English poet, one English poet. That's perfect, thank you. Yeah, on the old book, not the old. That's great. Perfect, thanks so much. Let's get one of these for home, actually. It was a funny time, really, wasn't it? I mean, there they were fighting for independence from England, and there they were fighting for England in Europe. Same people. But of course, Ireland isn't the same people. Ireland's lots of different people. And here we have an Englishman reading it. Sorry about that. The first poem is by somebody who needs no introduction, W.B. Yeats. And it's a poem he wrote as a sort of memorial for, I'm sure a lot of you know it, and I'm sure a lot of you know what I'm telling you, but just bear with me because one or two may not. He wrote for his great friend, Lady Augusta Gregory, in memory of her son, Major Robert Gregory, who volunteered to fight in the early Air Force, flying planes and bursting barrage balloons and dropping the occasional bomb and grenade, and also seeing what the enemy was up to and telling the artillery up a bit, down a bit. That was really his job. And he seems to me to have been an entitled young man, found life pretty unexciting, except maybe on the hunting field. And like many young men, thought, let's go and have a crack at Jerry. And he did this in a plane. And I think Yeats had the measure of him when he wrote this poem. When you fly one of those old planes, you balance it. You balance it on the wind. You balance it with your gear stick. And balance is something very big, I think, a big part of this poem, something Yeats had in mind. It's called An Irish Airman Foresees His Death. I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those that I fight, I do not hate. Those that I guard, I do not love. My country is Kiltartan Cross. My countryman is Kiltartan's poor. No likely end could bring them loss, or leave them happier than before. Not law nor duty bade me fight, nor public men, nor cheering crowds. A lonely impulse of delight drove to this tumult in the clouds. I balanced all, brought all to mind. The years to come seemed waste of breath, a waste of breath the years behind. In balance with this life, this death. The next poem is also by W.B. Yeats. He published it in 1920. Of course, he was Anglo-Irish. He was in England during the Rising. He was in England in 1916. I think he was somewhat uncommittal about the situation, about those friends of his who were Sinn Féiners. I think he held himself a touch aloof. They were his friends. And in this poem he mourns them, Countess Markievicz. He refers to as that woman. The Irish language teacher, Podrick Pearse. Thomas MacDonagh, who he'd helped with his poetry and whom he saw a great future for. And the fourth man he mourns is his own rival in love, John McBride, who married his love, Maud Gonne, who beat him to it, but who he disliked hugely because McBride, it was thought, had physically abused Maud Gonne, and he couldn't forgive him for that. Nevertheless, he lists him in this poem, which he calls Easter 1916. I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among grey 18th century houses. I've passed with a nod of the head, or polite meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite meaningless words, and thought, before I had done, of a mocking tale or a jibe to please a companion around the fire at the club, being certain that they and I but lived where motley was worn. All changed. Changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Hearts with one purpose alone through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone, to trouble the living stream. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud, minute by minute, they change. A shadow of cloud on the stream changes, minute by minute. A horse hoof slides on the brim and a horse plashes within it. The long-legged moorhens dive and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live. The stone's in the midst of all. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? That is heaven's part. Our part, to murmur name upon name, as a mother names her child when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. What is it but nightfall? No, no, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse. MacDonagh and MacBride and Connolly and Pearse, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Now a poet from Meath, I never knew, Francis Ledwidge. Born in a peasant's cottage, part of a large family in Janeville in Slane. Started writing poems as a young man. Extraordinary, really, when you come from a poor agricultural family and one of the children starts writing wonderful poetry. And he took it to Lord Dunsinane, who was the local guy. And Dunsinane recognized the extraordinary talent in his writing and encouraged him. At the age of 27, he volunteered, joined up with the Inniskillen Fusiliers. He enlisted because, as he said, I'm fighting against an enemy common to our civilization. His patron tried to persuade him not to. He said, I'll pay you a stipend not to go to war. But he went. In 1916, he was invalided home. He was recuperating in Manchester when he heard about the rising. Came straight back to Dublin, absented himself. When he heard of the execution of the leaders, including Pearse and MacDonagh, he said, 2 of my best friends shot by England. He was court-martialed for overstaying his leave and for being drunk in uniform. But he said to his brother, Joe, If I heard the Germans were coming in over our back wall, I wouldn't go out now to stop them. They could come. He was, after his court-martial, he was sent up to Derry, and eventually he got his stripe back, and he was sent back to the front. And he was killed some months later when he was rebuilding a road at the Third Battle of Ypres. They were sitting in a mud hole having a cup of tea when a shell blew him to pieces. But back in Dublin, before he returned to the front, as he stood in O'Connell Street and saw the wreckage from the post office down to the river, post office still smoking, he wrote this poem, which he called O'Connell Street. A noble failure is not vain, but hath a victory of its own. A bright delectance from the slain is down the generations thrown. And, more than beauty understands, has made her lovelier here, it seems. I see white ships that crowd her strands, for mine are all the dead men's dreams. Must have been extraordinary going back to the front. I think it's very hard to get one's head around the atmosphere and the attitude of that time, both in England and in Ireland, but especially in Ireland. But I suppose one has to be frank and say that work is work, and the army was a good job. This next poem is by Eva Gore Booth, Countess Markovitz's sister, another aristocrat, spending most of her time in England as a suffragist and a pacifist. And she returned to write this poem about a friend of hers, Francis Sheehy Skeffington, who was one of the heroes of the uprising, but was a pacifist. He was a Sinn Féiner, but he didn't believe in arms. He didn't believe in violence. And after the rising, he was in the streets trying to persuade the poor not to loot the shops. They didn't much like him for doing that. One evening he was at a political rally speaking, and on the way back home, some of the ex-looters recognized him, and a rabble formed following him and shouting out, "Skevvy, Skevvy!" And the military, of course, got involved and thought that he was the reason for the rabble and arrested him, took him to Gilmainham. And that evening they had a tip-off that there was a certain shop which was housing some Republican soldiers. In fact, their information was wrong. They got the name wrong. But they weren't to know that. They were led by a particular English officer whose name I forget. And he took his squad out and took Skeffington as a hostage, handcuffed among them. And when they got to the bridge, he divided the squad into two and said, "You go on ahead and attack the shop and get the men out from inside. And if there's a shot, Skeffington will go." If the squaddies came back, they'd caught two journalists who were inside the shop. They were pro-British journalists. But before the squad came back, this officer had had an argument with two young boys who were returning from a religious meeting, and obviously gave the soldiers gyp, and the officer shot one of them. And Skeffington made his feelings known and was silenced. When the squad came back after the raid on the shop with these two journalists, they were taken, Skeffington and the two journalists, and put in jail, Kilmainham. The following morning they were taken out by the same officer, and he got 10 or 15 men to wave their rifles at them, and they were shot and buried in the jail. The officer was later court-martialed, and was found to be insane. He had been sent back to the front from the front with shell shock. Nobody seemed to know that or worry about it. He was put into Broadmoor, mental institution in England, until the end of the war, when he was let free and was emigrated to Canada, where of course nobody noticed. Eva Gore Booth wrote this poem in memory of Francis She Skeffington. No green and poisonous laurel wreath shall shade his brow, who dealt no death in any strife. Crown him with olive, who was not afraid to join the desolate, unarmed ranks of life, who did not fear to die, yet feared to slay, a leader in the war that shall end war. Unarmed he stood in ruthless empire's way. Unarmed he stands on Acheron's lost shore. Yet not alone, nor all unrecognized. For at his side does that scorned dreamer stand, who in the olive garden agonized, whose kingdom yet shall come in every land, when driven men who fight and hate and kill to order shall let their weapons fall and know that kindly freedom of the will that holds no other human will in thrall. Now we get to a couple of poems, a couple of poets actually, who weren't born, didn't fight in the war, didn't fight in the Troubles, but whose parents did, his father did. The Galway poet, Pádraig Fallon, born in 1905 in Galway, in Athenry. Great admirer of Yeats and a friend of Yeats. He wrote this poem very late in life, writing about people who weren't normally written about, because those who came back from the First War were not very welcome here. They were people who had betrayed their country by fighting for the British. So if you wore khaki in the streets, you did so at your peril. So not only could they not talk about what they'd been through, but they had to hide themselves and keep their memories to themselves. It's the next generation we find who write about them, who talk about them, who, having watched their father and how he's become, understand perhaps a little, but not a lot, of what he went through. So here we have Porrick Fallon. The poem doesn't have the pain of some of the earlier ones, which he calls Dardanelles, 1916. Last night in-stomped our Connaught Ranger, Private Patrick Carty, on his way, fully accoutred now, a ramp of belts and bandoliers, a bayonet wags at his side with no wound yet. The heavy haversack sits high, filling the back kitchen, squinting down from the roof beams, shyly shaking hands all round the family, smiling. Me he picks up, and by God kisses me. Up there, under the brown white plaster, an unknown soldier's face is weeping. Do I remember more? The urchin daughters, bold for once and peeping, washed and ribbons through the door to wave him off on the mail, the 4:15, and away where muted now in a long sand he lies, if not entirely melted into the steadfast, bony glare of Asia Minor. Michael Longley, his father, Richard, joined the London Scottish as a boy soldier. He was awarded the Military Cross when he was 20. It's extraordinary, isn't it, to think of our boys of that age going off. His father died in 1960, really as a result of the wounds he'd received in the First War. And Michael writes a lot of poems about him. This is a very short one. He calls it Trench Foot. Christ is washing the feet of his company. He has an endless supply of talcum and old newspapers for lining their boots. He is promoted after Passchendaele. And now we just have two more poems. The first one is by an English poet, Siegfried Sassoon, young, upper-class man, great huntsman, great goer, a man for great appetite in life, a man who loved England, who loved the country, and who was one of the first to volunteer to go to war. Do you know that 35,000 Irish soldiers died in that war? 35,000. Don't see many memorials to them, do you? Sassoon, I think he took his own horses with him, actually, to the front. He thought it was going to be a bit of a hard day out in the saddle. And he was awarded, I think he got a VC. But his behavior was extraordinary. And looking at it now, it seemed so brave, it was almost suicidal. And I think something happened to him in the first 2 years of the war when he saw the reality of what was happening, where he felt a bit like the man in the first poem, Major Robert Gregory. What's the point? What's the point? Let's just go for it, like a man who's faced with an 8-foot-high jump on his horse. And he was wounded, and he came back. He was brought back to England in 1916, by which time he'd become violently anti-war and friend of Wilfred Owen, another great war poet. And continued always in life. He didn't have to go back because he was shell-shocked. He was actually in prison for a short time. And when the war finished, a year later, in 1919, he wrote this poem, which he called Aftermath, and which is a sort of, I think, meditation to himself, although maybe he was also speaking to other people, but I think he was really talking to himself. Have you forgotten yet? For the world's events have tumbled on since those gagged days, like traffic checked while at the crossing of city ways. And the haunted gap in your mind has filled with thoughts that flow like clouds in the lit heaven of life. And you're a man reprieved to go, taking your peaceful share of time with joy to spare. But the past is just the same, and war's a bloody game. Have you forgotten yet? Look down and swear by the slain of the war that you'll never forget. Do you remember the dark months you held the sector at Mametz, the nights you watched and wired and dug and piled sandbags on parapets? Do you remember the rats and the stench of corpses rotting in front of the front-line trench? And dawn coming, dirty white and chill with a hopeless rain? Do you ever stop and ask, is it all going to happen again? Do you remember that hour of din before the attack? And the anger, the blind compassion that seized and shook you then, as you peered at the doomed and haggard faces of your men? Do you remember the stretcher cases lurching back with dying eyes and lolling heads? Those ashen grey masks of the lads who once were keen and kind and gay. Have you forgotten yet? Look up and swear by the green of the spring that you'll never forget. Last poem is by Corkman, Patrick Galvin, born in 1927, only recently died, I think. Playwright, songwriter, author and poet, who himself joined the RAF for the Second World War in 1943. Patrick written a poem about his dad and his mum. Dad fought in the First War, and his mum was a Sinn Féiner and supporter of the Spanish Civil War and a very political woman. And of course a religious woman. And he wrote this poem about them, calling it "My Father Spoke with Swans." Leaning on the parapet of the Southgate Bridge, my father spoke with swans, remembering his days with the Royal Munster Fusiliers. India was dawn, the women cool, the sun cradled in his arms. Sometimes, when the clouds were wine, he washed his face in the Ganges. The swans rose from the lee and held their wings. Leaning on the mysteries of her twilight room, my mother spoke with God, remembering Pierce and the breath of Connolly. Ireland was new, the men tall, the land mirrored their brightness. Sometimes, when the eagles called, she walked the roads to Bethlehem. God opened his eyes, a loss for miracles. From these two, I was born, the Ganges swaying with the lee, and gunfire rising to a fall. My mother wore green till she died. My father died with swans. Only the rivers remain, slow, bleeding. Well, that's the end of the festival. Thanks for coming. Poem. Safe home.